Hi everyone, and welcome to this new episode of Music History 2. Today we're talking about Joseph Haydn, the first of the so-called First Viennese School. The First Viennese School is represented by the three Viennese classical composers, Joseph Haydn, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, and Ludwig van Beethoven. The Second Viennese School is about exactly 100 years, 120, 30 years later, and is made up of the three Viennese atonal slash 12-tone composers, Schoenberg, Berg, and Webern. But today we're only talking about Haydn and the First Viennese School. Haydn was Austrian. So in other words, his birthplace, the very small village of Rohrau, which is about 40, 50 miles south of Vienna, in a state that's called Styria today, which is one of the 9 states of Austria. And Haydn's dad came actually from rather simple circumstances, I would say. His dad was a carriage maker, so he built horse carriages. And his mother was a cook, I think. So very, if you will, bottom tier, just above peasants in the social structure of the time. So you might wonder, how is it possible that a kid like that was able to make such a career? By the way, Haydn was the oldest son of several, most of which actually became musicians. You may have heard Michael Haydn, who was a younger brother of Joseph Haydn and made quite a splendid career in Salzburg, Mozart's hometown. And of course, the Mozarts also knew Michael Haydn. And yet another son of Haydn actually became a singer and worked under Haydn in Esterhazy and for the Esterhazy family. So all the kids actually became musicians, and the question is, how is that possible in the 18th century? Well, it was possible because of the typical music education system of the time, which for boys was a route through boys' choirs that were attached to either large churches, such as cathedrals, or courts. And through their tenure as boy sopranos and boy altos, they received the musical training that then enabled them to pursue careers as musicians. And that's exactly what happened to Joseph Haydn. He was basically discovered by a talent scout, I guess you could say, 18th century talent scout, who was looking for boy sopranos and altos for the Cathedral of Vienna. Here's a picture of St. Stephen's Cathedral in Vienna. It's, of course, a Middle-age structure, and it looks the exact same today. And this is how Haydn got to Vienna, which, of course, as the resident of the Holy Roman Emperor, or in that case, Empress, because that was at that point already Maria Theresa, was an incredibly important place and the place to be if you wanted to be a musician, which wasn't quite a given, I suppose, for Haydn when he joined the boys' choir, but he showed very early on such considerable talent for music that very early on it kind of became clear that he was going to be a musician, which wasn't quite the will of his parents. They actually wanted him to pursue the typical career path of the firstborn boy in a family, which was a clerical position. So they wanted him to become a priest, but ultimately let Joseph have his will and let him become a musician. As I said, the membership in boys' choir at the time was the most typical career training of musicians. And that has been the tradition ever since really the beginning of time, if you will, but for sure ever since the Middle Ages. Because boy sopranos were, I said earlier, he was found by a talent scout. It was really one of the kapellmeisters of the cathedral. So the kapellmeisters were in charge of the music, but they also had to recruit new members for the choir. And above all else, also had to give room and board and clothes and everything that the boys needed, because the boys actually lived in the household of the kapellmeister and his wife. And that's kind of the cool, very whole music education that we're looking at the time, because basically the boys were exposed to music and music making, to composition, to performance, to singing, literally 24/7. First of all, of course, they sang every day in the church, but of course, particularly also on weekends and feast days. And little by little, they were trained not only in singing, but also in instrumental playing, such as keyboard instruments and violin. And through the keyboard instrument, also in figured bass, which was the first step towards composition. So it was a very thorough type of musical training that was like you could say, I guess, a complete immersion program into music for the time that the boys were in the choir, which was about 7 to 8 years, because turns out in the 18th century, boys changed voices when they arrived in puberty rather late, so they were about 15 or 16 years old, and so they had about 7, 8 years of musical training as choir boys. Haydn was then dismissed from the boys' choir. There's a funny story that he was actually kicked out because he cut off one of his fellow choir boys' ponytail, and was ultimately kicked out. And at first, really didn't have a job, obviously, but made a living, not a very good one, I suppose, as a singer. As freelancing, just all over the place, basically not making any money, but mainly just singing for food. That went on for a while. And whenever he did have some money, he bought books to further his musical training. And this is where Haydn connects the first time with some of the things that we've talked about earlier in this class. Because one of the first books Haydn bought was C.P.E. Bach's treatise on keyboard playing and basso continuo playing. And much later in his life, he recalled that he bought this book with the first money that he ever made. And he kept it very, very precious, because that's basically referring to what we've already said. C.P.E. Bach was just one of the main composers of the time, and Haydn really took C.P.E. Bach's music and his style, particularly the Galant style, as a starting point for his own compositional development. So this is where kind of yet another circle closes. And we'll see there are several other factors that we've already talked about, including Mannheim, and also a certain Dr. Burney, who will be important for Haydn's biography a little later. So Haydn is a freelancer now, living under really, really simple circumstances, and then eventually finds his first musical job as a musician for the Count Morzin, who's a Bohemian noble person who is looking for people for his chapel. The main condition of his contract, however, being that all the guys that the Count hired had to stay unmarried and therefore kind of celibate. And you can imagine that didn't work very long for Haydn, and he ultimately wanted to get married and was therefore dismissed from the Count's services. However, at that point, Haydn had already made such a good reputation for himself that, and he was a very good musician, so that the Count also helped find him his next better job. And then Haydn was hired by the Esterhazy family, for which he worked for the rest of his life. And throughout his life, in all kinds of autobiographical documents that we have from Haydn, Haydn never ceased to express his enormous gratitude for his life with the Esterhazy family. The Esterhazy family is a Hungarian noble family, an important noble family that also very, very close to the imperial family, so therefore has a lot of influence within the Holy Roman Empire. They are of Hungarian descent, but they had residences on both sides of the border, if you will. But remember, at the time, Hungary, the Queen of Hungary was also the Empress of the Holy Roman Empire. So there's, first of all, these very close connections between the countries. And Vienna also is geographically extremely close to the Hungarian border to this very day. So it's about 45 to 50 miles to the Hungarian border. And from Vienna, it's about 3 hours to Budapest, which is the capital of Hungary. So just to give you an idea how close all of that is. And so a little further south from Vienna, in a town called Eisenstadt, that was one of the residences of the Esterhazy family. And on the other side of the border in Hungarian territory, in a town called Fertőd, they also had a residence. Both palaces still exist, but particularly the Eisenstadt residence is very, very famous, and it's still actually in the Esterhazy family to this very day, although after World War II, Austria abolished nobility as such, but the noble families, while they lost their titles and their influence, they did get to keep most of their money and real estate. And so the castle of Eisenstadt, the palace, is still owned by the Esterhazy family, and today actually not that important for the Esterhazys, but really important for Haydn, because it is one of the main centers for Haydn Festival that's going on every year. Here are a few pictures. Here you see the outside of the Esterhazy Palace in Eisenstadt, and here you see the hall. That's now the concert hall, which was most likely the hall in which most of Joseph Haydn's symphonies were performed for the Esterhazy family. But the Esterhazy family also was really into opera. So here is a picture from Haydn's time of Haydn and his musicians performing opera in the opera theater that was built for Fertőd Castle. Haydn's job description was incredibly manifold. He, just like the Kapellmeisters that we talked about earlier today, he had to recruit new musicians, had to train and give room and board to the choir boys. He had to compose for all the typical realms of music making in the 18th century, which is the church, the theater, and the chamber. So the church, I think, is clear. That requires the composition of masses and composition of texts beyond the ordinary of the mass. So you have Kyrie Gloria, Credo, Sanctus, Benedictus, Agnus Dei. That's the so-called ordinary. And then you have graduals, offertories, sequences, alleluias, and vespers music that all needs to be composed for the church. And of course, not only composed, but also rehearsed and performed. Then is the music for the theater, which in the Esterhazy case means mainly operas and puppet operas. That was a specialty in the 18th century that people just loved. So there were actually a cast of singers and orchestra backstage, but the actors on stage were puppets. So Haydn had to compose operas, and he did, in fact, compose quite a great number of operas, but he's overshadowed by other contemporaries today, such as Gluck and Mozart. So his operas are not all that regularly performed anymore. And then, of course, the third realm was the chamber, which really means literally everything that's not theater or opera. So chamber music in the 18th century can really mean any type of secular vocal music, so cantatas, secular arias, whatever is used for dinner music or private entertainment. But it also means symphonies. So symphonies would be considered chamber music because they're also written in a style that's appropriate for the chambers, as opposed to the church and the opera. And then, of course, all that kind of stuff that we would consider chamber music today, which is quartets, trios, and stuff like that. Among other things, Haydn had to make music with the Prince Esterhazy on a regular basis, just like Maria Theresa and Frederick II. These very high noble people were very, very highly trained in music and liked to perform themselves. And so the Prince Esterhazy played a really weird instrument. It's called the baritone, and is basically a mixture between viola da gamba and cello. Some of the strings are played with a bow, like a viola da gamba, with an underhand grip. And some of the strings are actually plucked with the thumb. So it's actually a really cool instrument. And that's the reason why Haydn composed over 100 baritone trios, because the prince just enjoyed playing baritone trios whenever he had an hour or two off. And so also that was part of Haydn's job description, to which we now come back. So composing and performing with the prince, of course, also teaching the prince's children in music, because that's what one does in the 18th century with as part of children's education. And then, of course, Haydn was also an administrator of his own chapel, choir, singers, everybody. He was basically the key figure between the court administration, or the prince, if you will, the Esterhazy family, and the chapel. So whenever someone wanted a pay raise, or there were disciplinary problems, or someone got very sick and wanted to request to get a pension, all this kind of administrative stuff was also part of Haydn's job description. And we know, because a lot of those archival materials are actually extant, we know that part of the job was considerable, because the chapel was quite big, and it grew over time. So that Haydn was really busy just administrating, also making rehearsal schedules, making the programs for, putting together the programs for the performances and everything. So that of course was quite a big deal for him. And then it was also in his part of his job to purchase new instruments, take care of instrument maintenance, make sure that harpsichord makers, lute makers, organ makers appeared in Eisenstadt regularly to make sure that the instruments are working properly, buy strings, all of that kind of stuff. So literally everything that had to do with music was part of Haydn's job description. He had to do everything. And he seems to have been extremely successful at all of it. First of all, many contemporary accounts tell us that Haydn must have been one fantastic soul of a man. He was extremely liked by everybody because he was just such a good-spirited, good-natured guy. And that, of course, helped a lot. And he seems to have had an extremely positive attitude towards life, and just really enjoyed music making, and had a talent that seems to just look on the bright side of life. And whenever difficulties occurred, he must have been also a really good diplomat, and a talent at figuring out difficulties with other human beings. And so he was just the perfect solution for a job like that. And it looks like very early on, the Esterhazy family really began to keep him extremely precious and be extremely generous toward Haydn. Now, of course, times are changing, and it's, although for sure at the beginning Haydn was very much viewed, and also viewed himself as a servant of the court. I think I mentioned before that typically the musicians at a court also wore the uniforms that, let's say, servers were wearing, just to signify that they're servants. And yet, inspired by the Enlightenment, I've also mentioned that before, with that new understanding of the rulers of the time, and Frederick II certainly being one of them, and Maria Theresa following him very closely, and her son, we'll talk about him more, Joseph II, in connection with Mozart, just representing this really enlightened ideal of the ruler, where the ruler begins to more understand themselves as a servant to the people themselves. A God-given servant, but a servant. And so that really helps also change the role of musicians, not overnight, little by little. And as I said, Haydn remained in the services, officially speaking, remained in the services of the Esterhazy family for his entire life. But we do see with those composers of the first Viennese school, Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven, that really is about to change. Haydn remained employed for his entire life. Mozart remained only employed by a nobleman, in his case the Archbishop of Salzburg, for about half of his life, and made the other half of his life basically living as a freelancer. And Beethoven was only very briefly, as a late teenager, early adult, employed, but for the really biggest part of his life was not employed by anyone. And that just shows you how around 1800, the standing and the role of the musician, of the composer, really changed dramatically, if you will, for something very, very different. It's also more true for Haydn's case, that whenever you think about, well, why did Haydn, for instance, compose the baritone trios? Was he just really so much into the baritone? No, it was part of his job description. And that pretty much goes for most of Haydn's music. He composed it because it was part of his job. Now, we'll look into Haydn's music in a moment, but suffice it to say at this point that Haydn became very quickly a highly sought after composer, because he had several things figured out really well that made people just love his music. One of these things is his wit. Wit and wittiness became a very important component of music making of the time, because one of the ideals of upper class lifestyle, I guess, if you will, was the intelligent conversation. Let's say both men, but also women, would meet and hang out together, and then enjoy themselves and each other in intelligent conversations, where, you know, someone would say something witty and they could laugh, and they would have arguments, and it was a little bit like, I guess, like a debating team. So they really enjoyed making arguments and finding reasoning. Remember, Enlightenment is all about reason. And whenever someone, you know, was able to put something into a ruler, make an original observation, that was kind of the lifestyle of the time. And so similar things were also expected of music. So people would meet and then play, let's say, string quartets together. And the way the music is composed kind of resembles an intelligent conversation. So it's, and of course, if something is witty and lighthearted, it has the chance now to become really popular, and Haydn had that figured out very, very well. And I'll show you what that means in his music in a moment. So he had that. At the same time, Haydn was also really, really good at catering to the technical ability of the typical amateur of the time. So the music was not shallow, but also not unplayably difficult. But he had that figured out just right, that it was, hard enough so that it was viewed as a challenge, but also easy enough that the challenge could be mastered. And Haydn, together in pairing with his witty ideas in composition altogether, that made for extreme success. Now, Haydn was also a clever businessman, and although the music publishing industry really was still very early on in that development, but he had it figured out pretty early on, and first of all was able to get permission from the Esterházy family to actually sell his music to publishers. Because normally, if you're employed as a servant of the Count so and so, then it would be self-understood that whatever you compose is his, because he's been paying you. But as an early sign of the outstanding appreciation of the Esterházy family towards Haydn, they allowed him to, on top of his job with them, compose things that were really only composed to be sold over all of Europe. Now, at the time, there's no copyright or anything. So let's say if you published something in Vienna, chances are it'll be published in Italy, in England, in Paris very quickly, because as soon as copies actually got there, other music publishers just copied it and sold it. And you wouldn't see anything for it, of course. And so Haydn had that figured out very early on and made contracts with publishers in London, in Paris, and in Vienna so that he could make sure that he would get the revenue. And at the same time, his music was distributed all over Europe and helped, of course, the popularity of his stuff. And so very quickly, Haydn became kind of like the successor of C.P. Bach in terms of popularity. And everybody by the 1780s knew in Europe who Haydn was, and he was extremely sought after, and his music was played everywhere, particularly his chamber music, or what we would call chamber music, particularly string quartets, piano sonatas, piano trios, all of which he also wrote a whole bunch. So, and that's kind of the reason for it, because there was a demand and he was just extremely successful at selling these things.